Right. In this video, we're going to talk about the law of the seas, which mostly has to do with maritime boundaries and the way that the ocean is divided into political space. So it's going to be, we're going to examine the UN Convention of the Law of the Seas and the different kind of parts of it. We'll also talk about other issues related to maritime boundaries, as well as look at the way in which the Antarctic and the Arctic are politically organized as well. So terms to know from this video, first of all, the term law of the sea itself, kind of where it comes from and what we're talking about. And from the law of the seas, there are the vocab terms territorial waters, contiguous zone, the EEZ, which is the exclusive economic zone, as well as the high seas. And another concept that is related to maritime issues are called choke points, which we will discuss as well. All right, so first of all, let's talk about the law of the sea itself and what it is and what it does. So the UN Law of the Sea was essentially a giant convention in which countries came together to decide the rights and responsibility of countries with respect to the ocean. So essentially, they're answering a couple different questions. How does the idea of political sovereignty interact with the oceans and sort of who owns what, as well as the issues related to international trade and shipping that are complicated sometimes by political sovereignty. And the third question is sort of how should the ocean's resources be utilized, and how, where does a country's economic zone in terms of management of resources extend to? All right, so a lot of the important stuff is going to be in this graphic, and then we are going to sort of look at some other maps to examine these issues and how they actually look in the real world. Okay, so up to the country's coastline, obviously that is considered its sovereign territory. So right at the coast, and essentially that extends 12 miles out into the ocean. So that one is called a country's territorial seas, in which the sovereignty of a country sort of extends the same way that you would think of it in land. So that is considered to be the country's politically sovereign space. So the airspace kind of extends 12 miles out off the coast, as well as the water as well, and the continental shelf below. And there are some ways in which countries can allow the innocent passage of vessels from other countries, but they essentially are in charge of managing their territorial seas. So that is up to 12 miles off the coast of a country. And then 12 more miles, so from the 12 to 24 mile zone, are called the contiguous zone. So this is not quite as important as the other categories, but the contiguous zone, there is limited enforcement, mostly around things like immigration and crime, and kind of giving countries expanded powers to deal with those things that might be a little bit further off their coast. So like smuggling and crime and immigration issues and things like that, where you might see that occurring a little bit further off the coast. And then the big one in terms of management of resources is called the EEZ, so the exclusive economic zone. So that gives a country basically sovereign rights to explore, exploit, conserve, and manage living and non-living resources. So essentially, where this comes into play probably the most in terms of the frequency is fishing rights. So fishing rights and basically allowing, where people are allowed to fish in relationship to other countries. So that is an important way in which this comes into play. And also, talking about where, the management of resources in the underlying continental shelf, that for many countries means oil drilling below. So giving countries 200 miles off their coast where they essentially have this sovereign economic rights. So what happens between the 12 and the 200 mile mark is that countries aren't necessarily allowed to control or to patrol kind of other countries' vessels and things like that. So this is entirely economic for the most part. And then beyond that 200 miles is considered to be the high seas. So there are some really interesting characteristics of the high seas. Some ways in which anything goes, other ways in which there are, there is some international management, especially around resource use and things like that in the oceans, because you don't want it to be a complete free-for-all. But for the most part, that is considered to be the high seas. One exception to that is with regards to what we see down here, which is the continental shelf, right? So a country can have access or exclusive access to their own continental shelf if it extends beyond 200 miles. So that gets us into all sorts of very, very complicated territory about how we manage that and what is actually considered the continental shelf and things like that. And essentially, there is an entire department of the UN that is called the Commission on the Limits of Continental Shelf, that actually makes rulings about what is not a country's continental shelf. And most of the time, this is important for things like oil drilling and things like that. All right, so let's look at where these issues actually come into play. So this is the most important part of the world in terms of the law of the seas. So this is called the South China Sea, and this is basically China is the pink territory that you see up here, and you see all sorts of overlapping claims that exist within the South China Sea. So this is a really interesting. Basically, these are all sorts of overlapping territorial claims. So where you have seen conflict in this region is that China has continuously sort of built outward and outward, and claimed outward into the South China Seas to extend their sort of claims of sovereignty. So that has been seen in sort of annexation of different islands. There's actually been instances in which China's sort of built or constructed islands that were meant to extend their territorial claims kind of beyond. And China, basically, this is called the 9-dash line. But you can see, kind of given where the shape of the 9-dash line goes, what China claims. And the answer is basically all of it, right? So in reality, you have lots and lots of complicated issues because you have other countries that have their own claims, like the Philippines. You can see their kind of large territorial claims, as well as some other countries. And this is complicated because obviously, there are a lot of small islands that belong to a lot of different countries. You have ways in which the political space is jumbled together a little bit. So this is a source of frequent conflict and lots of appeals to the UN Convention of the Law of the Seas and rulings that happen. And then that has to be enforced, which that's usually where the sticking point is in terms of enforcing some of these issues. But you do have lots of conflict and lots of kind of aggressiveness, at least on the parts of China and some other countries, about wanting to expand their territorial claims into further and further outward into the South China Seas. So that is where we see this issue kind of come into play the most, kind of this hot spot. And you can see this is a map of China's passport, this is China's passport in the map that it has. So it includes all of these islands down here very purposefully to strengthen their own claims of kind of the territory that they have. So this is an issue that is related a lot to fishing too, because fishing is where we see these kind of conflicts frequently play out the most. And one thing that you might have a question about is what happens when two countries are 200 closer than 200 miles apart, and that is obviously something that happens very, very frequently. And the answer to that question is you have something called the equidistance line or the median line that is essentially drawn between two territories at the halfway point. So it's kind of the solution that you would think of is that we would just draw a line about halfway down the middle, and each country would get what's on both of its sides. And that is the solution that exists in many ways. So this is a particularly interesting part of the world in terms of maritime boundaries called the Strait of Hormuz, in which you can see Iran kind of up here, and then the Arabian Peninsula below, countries like Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the UAE and Oman, all of which are very oil-rich part of the country or part of the world. And this is, obviously where a lot of the world's oil comes from. So this is frequently a very, very guarded part of the world. And you can see the way that it is divided up politically in terms of who gets what. Iran, kind of the top half for the most part, and their territorial waters, and then the other countries below get kind of the bottom half. So this is actually considered to be the term choke point. So a choke point refers to a narrow passage that has the potential to restrict traffic to another region. So obviously within maritime boundaries, not every country is like the United States where we kind of 200 miles off of our coasts, there's not a whole lot there. So we're able to have our sort of unfettered exclusive economic zone. There's lots of places in which that doesn't necessarily happen. and some places in which, the potential for traffic to be restricted, or the potential for, tight spaces in which lots of countries are involved is high. So some of the ones that we're going to point out on the map are the Straits of Malacca here, where Singapore is, and you can see kind of that's where a lot of the world's traffic goes in terms of goods by ship. The Strait of Hormuz, which is what we just saw, where a lot of the world's oil comes from. And then the Suez Canal, which this is a picture from this week, actually, March of 2021, where a giant ship got stuck in the Suez Canal. And at this point, it has not been resolved, and who knows what's going to happen. But there is a giant backlog of ships waiting to go through the Suez Canal, because this giant ship with a bunch of shipping containers got stuck in the way that you see. So obviously, choke points are important from like a military standpoint. And you always have the thought that somebody might try to mess around with the world's economy and create problems in one of these really strategically important regions. But this photo shows us that sometimes people just mess up too, and it's might not even be a military thing that throws the world's economy into disarray. So the term choke point is important in terms of maritime traffic as well. All right, the last couple things we're going to talk about are Antarctica and the Arctic. So let's start with the Arctic, because there's a little bit more of a connection to the law of the seas. So as you can see up here, this is a picture of basically territorial claims that are in the Arctic. So because there is so much, because so much of the Arctic is subject to the law of the seas, you can see how the territorial claims sort of work, where Russia's claims over here, and then every country's kind of claims extend into their into the Arctic. So you have Alaska, Canada, Denmark because of Greenland, Svalbard, which belongs to Norway, and then Russia itself. So Russia and Canada are kind of the two biggest players in the Arctic, obviously, and then the United States is involved as well. So you do have some interesting kind of things that are related to this. First of all, we see kind of the territorial claims, but what we see is really important is the continental shelf below, and where drilling might come into play. And that is where we see countries being very adamant, and there actually being some conflict around kind of how far each country's continental shelf extends into the Arctic, and which part of the continental shelf belongs to which country. And there have actually been some interesting recent rulings and decisions made about this. So the Arctic is one area which, as climate change continues to happen and more of this space and more of the resources that are in the Arctic essentially become more accessible, you will see maybe become a little bit of a hotspot in terms of countries sort of wanting to extend their territorial claims further and further, and claim more territory. All right, and the last thing we'll talk about is Antarctica. So Antarctica is not super related to the law of the seas. It's privy to its own separate treaty that is from 1959. So you can see the different countries that are involved: Britain and Norway and Australia and France and New Zealand and Argentina and Chile. So the Antarctic Treaty in 1959 basically declared that Antarctica belongs to no one. And the most important part of this treaty is that it sort of froze at that point all of the claims and didn't allow anyone else to sort of say that they owned part of Antarctica. And what you might notice from this is we have a lot of claims that sort of overlap with each other, and a lot of ways in which this isn't really decided. And it's not really that important. You have all sorts of scientific research stations and stuff all over the continent. And there's actually a great deal of international coordination and cooperation, at least within science, in Antarctica. And what we do see is that what also is a really important part of this treaty is it essentially declared that there couldn't be any sort of military presence on Antarctica. So as in the height of the Cold War, as we were worried about nuclear weapons being put all over the place, this kind of set Antarctica as off limits for that. So no non-science military presence is allowed from any country. So you can kind of see. And the law of the seas, I think, extends kind of beyond these claims as well. Although the details I'm not entirely sure of for Antarctica, if it's any different. All right. So that's it. Thanks.